Hi, this is the Unwilling Pawn. I'm continuing with my sub-series of the war in Afghanistan, part of the 9/11 conspiracy theory series. Oil and gas. Petroleum and natural gas are fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, this is just a reminder, giving some background before we get into the oil and gas of the Central Asian states, particularly Afghanistan, or why the American ruling elites are concerned with the Central Asian states and their oil and gas reserves. What was the idea? What was the intention? What was the background? What were the plans? That sort of thing. And for that, we have to get into a little background, a little reminder of what oil and gas are. Fossil fuels are valuable resources that have formed by the slow decomposition of buried dead organisms like plants that contain energy from their ancient processes and from their effective heat and pressure beneath the Earth's surface. So that's a highly summarized little definition. Fossil fuels form over the course of millions of years, which means they will not naturally be replenished, perhaps for the entire course of mankind's existence on this planet. I say perhaps, I say should be most likely for the entire course of mankind's existence on this planet. So, bottom line is, once they're gone, they're gone. Due to this very nature, the concepts of reserves, demand, recoverability, like recoverable oil, peak production, peak oil, for example, consumption, and depletion are all of vital importance. Let's look at two of the most sought after fossil fuels, petroleum and natural gas. Petroleum, or crude oil, or even black gold, is a yellowish-black liquid found beneath the Earth's surface that is used as a fuel for all of our modern vehicles, automobiles, airplanes, trains, ships, for electricity-producing plants and machines, generators, for example, for manufacturing plastics, for the functioning of just about all industrial production equipment, you name it. Basically, everything that we use has some touch of oil in it. It wouldn't be produced as much. We wouldn't have the transportation, logistics, if everything wasn't using oil. Oil is the fuel that runs much of the world's economy. In some way or another, it's connected to oil. It is measured in barrels, where one barrel is approximately 42 US gallons, or approximately 159 liters. And I think the US gallons may be the exact measurement, 159 liters is approximate, but regardless. Natural gas, or gas, is any chemical compound in its gas state of matter that is found in pockets beneath the surface of the Earth and can be used as a source of energy for heating, cooking, generation of electricity, the development of commercial fertilizers, and many other uses. It is measured in volumetrics, often in cubic feet or cubic kilometers. When we're talking about reserves of the entire country, then usually we're going to talk about cubic kilometers. In fact, we never talk about cubic feet, but in different contexts, it could be cubic feet that you see that measurement it measured in. But for the purpose of reserves of an entire country, how much oil and how much natural gas does a particular country have? It reserves of its own, so it doesn't have to import. That's very important. How much can it produce? How much does it have? And how much does people use? How much do they have to import? That's of vital importance to all countries, and that's just America. Especially industrialized countries like Europe. According to the intelligence community-raised investigative reporter and former LAPD, that's Los Angeles Police Department, narcotics officer Michael Rupert, in his documentary film 9/11 Truth and Lies. Now, I've given the link here in the blog so you can check it out. Exact quote from his documentary. In 100 years, mankind has consumed half of the petroleum and natural gas ever produced, while demand has increased exponentially. So mankind stands at the brink because we have reached, or will soon reach, peak production. The point at which production of oil will not increase any further. I've given a little link here of world annual oil production and peak oil. It's a little graph that shows basically the idea of peak oil, or understanding that we're approaching peak oil, or the fear of peak oil, and where they thought in the past that we have reached peak oil, and it turned out that we hadn't. But if we have, we'll get into this a little bit more, but peak oil means there's no more oil, and they're doing obviously now that the entire world is using it. It's not the same case as it was back in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s. Far more technology, more countries, everyone's using oil now, those who weren't using before, and everyone's demand has increased exponentially, of course. So it's not like people haven't discovered new places where everything's discovered now. It's highly unlikely that you'll find some great magical reserve that has so much that can feed the entire world's desire or need for oil. But we'll get into that a little more. The cited source shows a peak production graph with various peak year scenarios. So these were scenarios. There was thought that maybe we reached peak oil in 2020, 2010, 2005, whatever, different year dates here. So peak oil, we're not there yet, but once we're there, it'll be complete disaster for the world, disaster for the world's economies. This graph is provided by the British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy. While we're not sure which year will be the peak year, we know that it's near. Why? Tireless efforts have been made to find all new reserves. Demand is increasing rapidly, and people are running out of ideas on where to get that last bit of oil from in a cost-efficient manner. That last unknown oil reserve, currently unknown, trying to discover that last oil reserve. The world consumes approximately 35 billion barrels in a year, while the total known, plus hopeful, reserves amount to something in the neighborhood of 1,800 to 2,200 billion barrels. Now there's always an unknown here, there's always a doubt here. Countries don't always advertise it, so I'll get to the sources in a bit. At this pace, assuming demand and consumption does not increase significantly, the world's oil reserves will run dry in around 62 years, best case scenario. It'll probably be done a lot before that, unless you magically discover some new unknown oil reserve, currently unknown. Natural gas is also either at peak production or fast approaching it. Mike Rupert said, again a direct quote, "Alternative energy sources are vastly overrated, and none of them, in any combination, can replace what oil and gas have done for mankind in the last 100 years." End quote. Given this, certainly one can understand the desperation of the world governments in acquiring these limited resources. If only they would be as desperate in developing technology to reduce our dependence upon oil and gas while looking for short-term solutions. So you can go seek oil wherever you can find it, oil and gas, but also be looking for ways to reduce our dependency on it. If only they wouldn't move forth with a consumption without regard for sustainability attitude towards resource management. If only they wouldn't start fights with every race on this planet, trampling the rights of billions in order to keep their economy going. Hopefully, Mike Rupert was wrong about alternative energy, and I think he was. There's a lot more potential there than he anticipated when he did his documentaries. But the transition that needs to be made has to get faster. Hybrid technologies are an excellent idea, but the awareness, mindset, and intention has to be there. So the peak year scenarios of this graph is 2005 potential peak, 2010 potential peak, 2020 potential peak. The actual seems to be leveling out close to 35 billion, but we'll see by 2030, by 2040. Once you arrive at that peak oil, you're in trouble. The entire world's in trouble. Because everyone knows now production will only decrease, which will make oil prices sky high, as if they're not high enough already. Petrol prices and everything. Oil and gas producers and their reserves. 60% of all recoverable oil, that is the oil that we already have access to from sources with established infrastructure and well-known reserve capacity, is in the Middle East. And 11% is in Iraq. And this is after all of the looting by Halliburton, everyone. So it's not like America's not looting oil, mainly American oil companies. It's not like they're looting oil, not looting oil for Iraq, but it's after all that looting, there's still 11% of the recoverable oil that's known reserves are in Iraq. Other non-Western large quantity oil producers apart from the US, Russia, and China include Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. For natural gas, apart from the US, Russia, China, and the Middle East, on the list of the largest non-Western producers are Indonesia, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. While there are proven reserves of oil and gas that have not been fully exploited due to the lack of infrastructure, and more may even be discovered in the Arctic or otherwise extracted or produced, the cost and time to build the technology required to extract that last bit may not be worth it for mankind to invest in. Now here's a very important key point, in my opinion. As the world gets more and more desperate to get its hands on the last bit of oil and gas, as awareness spreads of peak production for these fossil fuels, just use your good sense to gauge what will continue to happen to prices, economies, and politics in the world. And this is like a doomsday type scenario. And this is what we're approaching. Inevitably, until you reduce, unless you're reducing your dependence on oil, it's a real doomsday scenario. To think about it just scares the shit out of everyone, and it should. It should. It should scare you. It's a dark, dark reality. Because you're so dependent, we're all so dependent on oil and gas. What if they just run out? And they're gonna run out. They're fossil fuels, by their very nature. It's a scientific fact, reality. The only hope you can have, well, maybe we'll discover more research. Where are you going to discover them? And how much is it going to cost to get them? With the world spread out already aching for oil, trying to find oil wherever and whatever they can, you think it would probably have been discovered by now. I don't think there's that much more left. Besides the known reserves, I don't think there's that many unknown oil reserves available at all for the world. To really understand what would provoke countries to act and where they would act, we should compare the proven reserves of oil producing nations with their actual production annually. So from the Wikipedia compilation of figures, well cited. So you can go to Wikipedia here about the oil producing countries and gas producing countries. And they all cite their sources according to the CIA World Fact Book, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, British Petroleum, and other oil companies. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, a bit more than Saudi Arabia's even. But their production is little more than 1/5 of Saudi Arabia's. From examination of the list of countries where significantly more oil can be produced and exported, those that are underproducing in the greedy, desperate eyes of the United States establishment, we can understand much about what's going on in the world and even predict much of what will happen. Now, our focus is on the Central Asian states and, of course, why America went into Afghanistan, of course. But it's important to note that a lot of these countries we're going to discuss, I've given you a little list here of countries. So let's start with the oil reserves and production. So America, and you see the desperation, the need. United States of America, 47 billion barrels total in reserve. That's America's own oil. That's America's own production, what America can produce potentially from what America's own reserves. Based on the current rate of production, America has 15 years left. 15 years of production left at the current rate. That's not that very long. That's a couple of administrations. And then when countries plan, they have to plan for much longer than that. 15 years of nothing. That's big trouble. That means, besides those 47 billion, America's consumption is far greater, has to import oil. So where's America going to get its oil? Obviously from the Middle East. Halliburton looting Iraq and many other examples. Libya. We'll get to that. Let's get to the list. Venezuela. 302 billion barrels total in reserve. And these are quite recent facts. I believe they're 2021 facts or 2020. They're 2021, I think. Most of these facts, the stats and figures. That's their production rate is quite low as compared to, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia and everyone else. So they have 364 years. Now that's the one who's desperate for oil. What's he going to think? Well, we need to do something about Venezuela. They have all this oil, and they're not producing anything. And they're certainly not exporting to us or whatever. They're not exporting in dollars, and they want to challenge the U.S. dollar. There's a lot going on, and that's why Venezuela, always under attack. Regime change after regime change after regime change, hyperinflation. Venezuela. America's always involved. We have to do a separate documentary on that. I'll mention briefly this later, but Venezuela, high on the target list. They don't have like very friendly relationships with the United States. A lot of other people believe that America is always doing regime change, which it is. CIA is involved. So, obviously, American oil companies aren't there. So they're like, okay, we can do much better production. And there's all that oil. There's all that black gold we desperately need. We need to get Venezuela in our network, on our team, or send them to hell. Saudi Arabia, 267 billion oil reserves, billion barrels, and at current rate production, 70 years. Canada, 167 billion. Canada is already an obviously friendly country, but even Canada has its examples. I remember I was in Calgary, Alberta, and the Albertans were telling me that basically their premier had sold, premier is they're like the governor of their province. Their premier had sold them out because he let America just come in and strong-arm them. Because when America found out that in the northern areas, the icy parts of northern areas of Canada's two provinces, British Columbia and Alberta. These are Canada's westernmost provinces. And British Columbia is where Vancouver is, and Calgary, Alberta is in Alberta. So these in the northern areas of these two provinces of Canada, there's huge oil reserves. And when they discovered that, America just went in and took over and said, okay, hey, Canada, hand it over. And Canada obviously is not going to challenge America, not going to challenge Big Brother. So, but it's not that Alberta didn't benefit, but the people were saying that we could have gotten a lot better deal. And America just came in strong-armed prices, oil prices, how everything was going to be sold. And obviously America had the expertise. American oil companies just came in and just took over. Strong-armed everything in Canada. Yes, sir. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. So even Canada, a Western ally, a neighbor of the United States of America, say, yes, boss. I don't want to challenge Big Daddy. 167 billion oil reserves, 126 years at current rate of production. So they got quite a bit. And they're producing a decent amount because America's there. Iran, 155 billion, 107 years. Now Iran, America doesn't have a good relationship with. So what are they doing with Iran? Sanctions after sanctions, sanction them to hell. Call them terrorists, call them this, call them whatever you need to. Sanction them to hell. Why? Because I don't have control of your oil resources. And I shouldn't. I have the technology. You dumb Arabs and Middle Easterners and desert turban-wearing dumbasses. I mean, you don't know how to do anything. It's my technology. I'm the one. God should have given me this oil. But he gave it to you bastards. So I need it. It's mine. Iraq. Halliburton looting Iraq. 145 billion reserves. 89 years at current. production left. Kuwait, 104 billion. Kuwait, I didn't put in bold because I believe Kuwait is more friendly on friendly relations with America. 97 years at current production. UAE, 98 billion reserves, 87 years at current production. Russia, 80 billion and only 21 years at current production because Russia uses more, consume more, they produce more, they also use more. They need oil for their own country, and of course they do export some. Libya. Remember the whole Gaddafi incident? Libya. 48 billion reserves, 132 years. So underproducing. They have a lot more oil, they can produce a lot more. If America had a more friendly relationship, more presence there. When Gaddafi was replaced, the rebel groups, one of the deals that they had with the French, I believe it was France, that they were going to sell 35% of the oil to them. And obviously Gaddafi was boycotting them, or was going to sell, he was trying to make some African golden dinar, some new currency based on gold or something like that. It's one of the many reasons why they're like, what the hell with you, buddy. Venezuela talked about certain things similar to that. The hell with you. You gotta go, buddy. We all gotta die. We need that effing oil, and we need it now. So underproducing. They have far more potential. Like America is basically saying, well, you need to produce more. You can produce more. And if my technology and infrastructure were there, then I can get more oil out of your reserves. Obviously, at a rate that is good for my people. And definitely for the oil companies. America cares less, especially the oil companies, the big wigs. They care far less about how cheap your petrol is, how cheap your gasoline is when you go for a fill-up. They care a lot more about how much money they can make from it. And obviously that countries need. Everything depends upon oil. Nigeria. I don't have too much information about Nigeria. I heard there's some plans and there's some stuff going on in Nigeria. 36 billion reserves, 51 years. Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan's only 30 billion reserves. Nothing compared to the larger ones. 52 years at current production. So Kazakhstan's okay, and American oil companies are there, but Kazakhstan's, they were trying to get there, but they couldn't. We'll talk about that more later, but Kazakhstan was a huge disappointment. At the time when all of these plans were being made, we'll talk about more the 1998 book of Zbigniew Brzezinski. He thought his plan and the plan of American ruling elites, top strategists like him, they thought that Kazakhstan would have oil reserves that would dwarf, his exact words, dwarf the reserves of the Middle East combined. But he was wrong. And this was a huge disappointment for the American ruling elites and the Western ruling elites, that Kazakhstan turned out to be far less oil rich than they originally thought it was going to be. After Kazakhstan, you have China. 25 billion barrels of reserves left, and only 18 years. Obviously, China is desperate, trying to do solar and all kinds of other, alternative energy resources. And China's making a lot of it happen, but they're desperate for that. Why? Because they know if you can't produce energy through the oil, which we have very limited reserves, it's only going to last 18 years at the current rate of production and consumption. Obviously, the consumption for their own people mostly. China has had a energy crisis. So for America, it wasn't just about getting oil for its own people, also keeping China and Russia at bay. Make China and Russia desperate. Russia, only 21 years left of production of their own reserves. Again, everything else has to be imported. For your own people or for whatever, for the actual consumption. So production that you mean to produce or you need. So most of that production for Russia, China, and America goes to their own people. Their own country's needs. And all of these big powers only have 15, 21, 18 years left, where others have far more. Because they have the more technology, obviously China, Russia, and America. And they have bigger need, more people, larger economies. So they have a far greater need to go anywhere and everywhere for oil. Desperate for oil. Now we move to natural gas proven reserves versus actual production. So for natural gas proven reserves versus actual production, from this list we shared here, we see the following. America with 13,167 cubic kilometers total reserves, 14 years, only 14 years of production left at current state. Remember, America has quite a few states that, especially the northern states, and even central and southern states some, but mostly the northern states definitely are going to take a big hit because they depend upon that natural gas for heating, especially during the long winter months. Heating. 14 years only. Everything else has to be imported or stolen or whatever. Russia advertises big time of its abundant natural gas resources, largest in the natural gas reserves in the entire world. 47,798 cubic kilometers, 77 years left at current production. And even with the high level production or exporting, whether consumption or exporting, but they have to produce. They're producing that much at that level of production. All about 48,000 cubic kilometers. Iran, 33,980 cubic kilometers, 142 years at current production. Qatar, 23,871 cubic kilometers, 143 years at current production. See, Iran is highly rich in both natural gas and oil. See why they're one of the targets. Russia and China are all automatically understood because they're America's rivals. They're always going to be on America's radar. But it's not so easy to invade them. It could start World War III. So then you have Qatar, 23,871 cubic kilometers, 143 years. After that, Turkmenistan, 11,326 cubic kilometers, 135 years. And Saudi Arabia has 9,432 cubic kilometers, 83 years. China, after that, UAE, Nigeria, Venezuela, Algeria. Venezuela, again, has a decent amount. Not very high. Nigeria also has a decent amount. Nigeria has 125 years left at current production. Venezuela has 246 years, so they're not producing very much natural gas at all. Algeria, Iraq, same thing. Have a reasonable amount, small amount, not huge amount, but never a reasonable amount, and 340 years at current production, current rate of production. So they could produce a lot more, and give it to American tankers so they could be exported, or to make China, well, not China for sure, Russia desperate. China's not even on this list, or China was on this list, yeah, 6,654, but only 37 years left at current production. So China's oil and gas crisis, you could say. China's desperate for both. Whereas Russia has plenty of oil, reasonable amount of oil resources, and a more than abundant natural gas. So America needed to take away some of Russia's extra imports, exports. So China is the biggest importer. We'll talk about this from the Central Asian states already. Russia as well, but China, definitely. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan are there, but they don't have significant large. I just mentioned them on the list because we get Kuwait, Azerbaijan, Norway, and Libya are on this list. They could all definitely produce more. With the exception of Uzbekistan, I think they're producing based on what they have. From the above lists, you can start to understand which countries have been and still are of America's primary interest for fulfilling oil and gas needs. Think about the politics from the last 30 to 40 years. The nation building, liberation, occupations. We're going to liberate these people, we're going to liberate those people. Riots, civil wars, rebellions. All the rebellions America supported here and there. What were they really about? Benghazi, this and that. Libya. Why? Oil. Gas some, but mainly oil. Especially with Libya. Human rights, rescue missions, political ideology conflicts, religious tensions, the crushing of civil liberties at home, anthrax, terrorism, racism, xenophobia, everything. Just think about how the corporate news media has behaved, how frantically U.S. leaders got America in these wars. All the wars they're sowing the seeds to right now, as we speak. The endless war machine, all of the lies, immorality, corruption, thievery, treachery, thuggery, everything you have seen in the years gone by. Or those who haven't seen what you've read about, what you've heard about, what you've been taught by your parents, by the world, recent history, what's still going on because of that recent history. We'll focus on the Central Asian states' interest for the purpose of this paper and videos because we're analyzing America's war in Afghanistan. But it is still important to note that the U.S. is heavily involved with most of the aforementioned countries, or will be in the future. The point is, America needs oil and gas, and so do many other countries. China, for example, desperate for both. And also desperate to get into alternative energy wherever it can. But oil and gas, there's no real replacement at this point. You can use hybrid technology and reduce your dependence upon them. But you can't get rid of your dependence upon oil and gas right away. That's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of investment. The mindset has to be there. Intention has to be there. And so you see all these countries, they're going to have conflict. Endless conflict. Why? They have oil and gas. The big powers definitely America. Going to be there in one way or another. Oil and gas, oil and gas, oil and gas. That's it for this video. I'm gonna obviously get into the Central Asian now, direct relation to all the events related to 9/11, and particularly oil and gas, related to both, really, their connection that America did in Afghanistan. What really happened? Remember that oil and gas. It's not that even now, by now, even well before, America knew that Kazakhstan was a disappointment. Probably in the early 2000s. Well, a little bit after they started the war in Afghanistan. By then, American companies knew that Kazakhstan didn't have the oil reserves they had hoped. So it was a disappointment. But that doesn't mean that there's no oil and gas there. And also, the idea was to undermine China and Russia. Make China desperate for oil and gas. If it can't get it from Kazakhstan, or some from there, some from elsewhere, China will continue to be desperate and depend upon America for that oil. And then America can use that for manipulation or dealing, because I don't want to be dependent on China for the mineral wealth, for rare earth elements, and China's dependent on me for nothing. So keep them dependent on me, particularly for something they're desperate for. Their entire economy will depend upon oil and gas. Russia less so, but certainly that control can be exercised over China. So it was about undermining them. Is also about America being everywhere. Central Asia is just one of the places. It's not like a gold mine in terms of oil and gas, but it's one of those places that has a reasonable amount of reserves. Turkmenistan's at the top of the list for natural gas. Kazakhstan's there on the list, but not exactly at the top of the list. But it's there. It has a reasonable amount of reserves for gas. So Kazakhstan for oil and Turkmenistan for natural gas. They still have those reserves. They're still important. And they certainly were considered a gold mine before America invaded Afghanistan in 2001. To oust the Taliban. So that's it. This is going to be oil and gas 1. I'll have to make a separate oil and gas 2nd video. We're going to get into Cent Gas Pipeline, Unocal, Halliburton, Chevron, timeline of events. Very important. Very important, the chronology here. Hamid Karzai and Cent Gas. Hamid Karzai was the first interim president after the Taliban were removed. The first puppet. Central Asian Resources, and of course sovereign right when I finish up the oil and gas section. So I think I can do that in the 2nd video. I'm trying to keep these videos reasonable in terms of time, not make them hour long and everything. So that's it for this video. We'll continue this in the next video. In oil and gas 2 is what I'm going to call the video. As usual, please like, share, subscribe, spread the awareness. very important facts that we either need to be reminded, for those who know, and for those who don't know, to be educated, understand what's going on in the world and why it's happening, with some actual facts. And again, our focus is on the war in Afghanistan, but many of these facts they explain all of what's going on much in the world, not just in Afghanistan, not just related to 9/11, but they're deeply tied to 9/11. We'll get into more of that in the next video. Well, thank you very, very much for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe. This is the Unwilling Pawn, signing off.